Welcome back to the afternoon plenary. This is a very special plenary. It's our leaders plenary. We have very eminent speakers today. And this session will reflect on the lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis and what that means for how we manage knowledge, how we inform policy making and our responses, and what this means for us if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and address the climate crisis. To set the scene for this very interesting discussion, I'm very happy and honored to welcome Mr. Ban Ki-moon. He has been the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, now the chairperson of the Ban Ki-moon Foundation. As the father, if I may say, of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Secretary General of the UN at the time, I'm sure you have reflections and messages for us that hopefully we in the international development take on board to improve collaboration. So now over to you, Mr. Ban.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Susanna Roth. Honorable Prime Minister Flame Naomi Mataafa of Samoa, Honorable President Masatsugu Asakawa of ADB, Dr. Sumiya Swaminathan of WHO, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for all your participation in this very important event. COVID-19 has upended the world we are living in, magnified existing inequalities, and worsened socio-economic tensions. The pandemic has made clear that we are living in an interconnected world, and no country, regardless of its size, wealth, or technological sophistication, can tackle COVID-19 alone. To respond to the unprecedented impacts of the coronavirus, we must understand that pandemics are inherently global issues and strive to learn from each other. Cooperation and solidarity, partnership, and global governance are needed in our fight against COVID-19. The pandemic is not the result of one virus. It is the consequence of well-known and understood deficiencies across multiple systems, including health. Applying the whatever it takes approach pursued by so many countries leads to an ethical dilemma. We act within our own borders and not as a global society. In Asia and the Pacific, millions of people will be pushed back into poverty, which impacts lifelong opportunities. As well as how to overcome the crisis in front of us, we need to think about the world we will face once this crisis passes. We need to be prepared in advance. Global hyperconnectivity powered by information and communication technology and social media has proven to be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can stabilize the global response to the pandemic by spreading scientific and verified information. However, on the other hand, it can easily destabilize and devastate the painstaking efforts to cope with the pandemic and by spreading false rumors and fake news. At the early stage of COVID-19, the lack of scientific knowledge and the overwhelming amount of inaccurate and unverified information created huge chaos and uncertainties in global and national response. Failure to respond appropriately in the initial stage in many countries increased uncertainty and confusion, unnecessarily politicizing the local and global response. This exacerbated social instability and resulted in the collapse of global partnership and systematic management of the pandemic. On the extreme panic triggered by uncertainty, people easily fell into herd mentality and group thinking. Local, national, and global governance for scientific management of the pandemic could not properly settle in. The lessons learned can provide important insights for other governments and societies in their efforts to deal with the coronavirus and its societal aftershocks. Assessment of experiences and responses to COVID-19 in one country with remarkable progress can provide lessons and implications for other countries, which still have been struggling with health, social, and economic crisis triggered by COVID-19. The establishment of a new global information and technology-based response platform allows vetted scientific information and sustainable policy options for dealing with COVID-19 to be rapidly accessible to all countries. The floods of fake news and the failure to respond to COVID-19 in many countries, especially in the early stage, demonstrated the importance of knowledge management for accessing credible and timely information. How about the SDGs under the COVID-19 situation? Frankly speaking, progress made on the SDGs is fragile. SDGs did not consider sufficiently how institutions will be strengthened and capacity will be built to implement them. Development organizations, multilateral development banks, and governments often focus on quick wins and tangible results. While the COVID-19 pandemic has caused untold devastation around the world, it also provides us with a generational opportunity to build back better. We must strengthen our health systems and reduce inequalities to be prepared for future pandemics and build a better future for all. Every country must recognize that the only way to achieve these objectives is through effective knowledge sharing, multilateralism, and regional cooperation. The international community must elevate its collective efforts to address this crisis and develop its information sharing capacities. Information and knowledge sharing are public goods. I could summarize 3 lessons we learned from the COVID-19 crisis. First, we need to consider the benefits and losses for global society, not for each country. What we destroy now and cannot gain back later. Managing uncertainties and complexities requires transparency. The Republic of Korea, my country, for example, who successfully managed the crisis, had systems in place for rapid and transparent response, risk management, community engagement, and scenario planning. The Korean example could be shared for the global benefits. Second, governments need to enhance their capabilities to create dynamic safety nets for workers, design contracts that foster bottom-up experimentation so that public funds have a higher multiplier and crowding in effect, yield a proactive relationship with data and digitalization, and foster partnerships. The same combination will be crucial to build resilient and inclusive societies in the long term. Third, governments must enhance global and regional cooperation, facilitate trade for crisis response, and recognize that investment in public health research related to intellectual property and patents are part of global public goods. Ultimately, The above-mentioned three lessons learned from the pandemic must reinvigorate the necessity of cooperation and solidarity based on multilateralism and guide us to a more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ban. I think you made it very clear what you're asking from the global society and the community and from all of us. Now let's start some reflections, and I'd like to invite now our very eminent panel to join Mr. Ban. We have with us today Honorable Fiame Naomi Mataafa. She's the Prime Minister of the independent state of Samoa. Thank you for being here today. We have with us President Massa. He's the president of the Asian Development Bank. And we have also with us Somya Kamanasun. She's the chief scientist of WHO. So we can see eminent speakers from various fields of the global community and of leaders. And maybe we start with the Honorable Fiame. Probably you are at the ground. You are a leader of a country. You have to now think about Sorry, I think we need to make sure. Yeah, okay. You have to think about recovery policies. And probably you also have to think about how we are now implementing these global commitments and the global statements at the ground. So my question for you is, how are you involving your communities when you're now planning for your recovery policies?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Mr. Chairman, Ban Ki-moon, and my fellow panelists, Talo Falava from Samoa. You will appreciate that I'm a fairly newly elected Prime Minister, and I'm very happy to be participating in this forum in the very early days of this administration, because I think the issues that are being raised here are critical issues for all governments, and especially as an incoming new administration. These are issues that we'll be having to grapple with immediately and more urgently. Of course, the COVID challenge and the climate challenge has been with us for a significant period. So we've already been experiencing the changes and the impacts that it has had on our respective countries and communities. Coming back to the question, our government works through the Ministry of Women, Community and Social Development to reach our village communities, non-government organizations, academia, media, and our faith-based institutions. The feedback and recommendations from stakeholders, they form the basis of determining the prioritization of our recovery plans, their implementation, and of course, importantly, the sourcing of the financing. Given our vulnerabilities to natural disasters, our communities at village and district levels are engaged in village development plans, which are activated pre and during disasters and include recovery plans and activities for implementation. Since the lockdowns, the government has provided stimulus packages with increased access to specific financing facilities for civil society and our private sector. On community mobilization, this is key to our public health programs for national vaccination campaigns for the 2019 measles epidemic and the COVID-19, and of course the general immunization programs. The community collaboration enabled the adoptions of lessons learned from the measles epidemic in order to build back better for the more current COVID pandemic, has fast-tracked our readiness through public awareness campaigns. Our approach to reach and involve our communities rests on what we see as effective stakeholder engagement. This is a norm when national policies and strategies are publicly debated. We see our stakeholders as having a key specific stake in the outcome of a decision or impacted by a policy or position. We practice community engagement through the information sharing, consultation, and seeking feedback, and active participation between government and our communities. Due focus is, of course, given to inclusion of diverse stakeholders in our communities, particularly our vulnerable groups. Our last point is effectively engaging stakeholders. We see that this has led to more socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable outcomes through a realistic understanding of the problems and the issues, recognition of the systemic nature of the way things are done. There is, of course, greater than social acceptance, support, and reduced conflict, and potential for creative, equitable solutions, and of course, saving time and money. So that's my contribution, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Honorable Fiame. So you bring it back to the community, and you're saying we need to listen to our stakeholders and civil society. So maybe another question for you there is, did you change that during your, since you are Prime Minister, did you involve the communities more?
Madam Moderator, our social construct, it provides a very easy access to our communities. It's not a difficult way of work or approach. It's almost the natural way that we work with our communities. And the strength really of any government, not just my new government, is the recognition that communities are very well established and well organized, and it makes it easier to roll out national programs and especially to hold consultations with different groups.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very clear. I think that's what we see in many countries, right? That the local communities, local government were the ones who actually acted and were able to provide the response that is needed. So thank you. So let's move now. Thank you, Honorable Fiame. Let's move now from the community level to the level of an organization. And I'd like to invite President Massa and share with us, President Massa, you came as a new president to the organization just before the pandemic came. I mean, what kind of difficult challenge you must have had. We went virtual overnight. So if you can share with us, how are you reflecting now on the priorities that we as ADB have to respond not only to immediate needs, but also to the recovery? Are we changing our priorities?
Okay, thank you, Susan, and dear panelists. Good afternoon, everybody. And Mr. Van Keven, thank you very much for your very rich and comprehensive keynote speech, which surely provided a lot of food for thought for our forthcoming discussion. And thank you very much, Prime Minister Matafat, for emphasizing the community-based solution, how to deal with this pandemic so far. As Mr. Pan Given rightly pointed out, obviously we should continue to focus on achieving our long-term goals for the region, like those laid out by Strategy 2030 and SDGs, while also responding to the immediate challenges posed by the pandemic. We are facing both. So let me begin with the immediate challenges. After the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, ADB took, I think, bold and creative measures to address the rapidly escalating needs of our clients. For example, we announced a $20 billion comprehensive response package in April last year, which, among others, includes over $10 billion in quick disbursing budget support. We were supporting budget financing directly through our so-called COVID-19 pandemic response option, or in short, CIPRO. In addition, we also launched our $9 billion Asia Pacific Vaccine Access Facility, in short, we call it APVAX, in December last year to support the effort of our developing member countries, or DMCs, to access and distribute vaccines safely and swiftly. We are seeing the positive impact of vaccination rollouts through decreasing death rates. But as everybody would agree, our pandemic is not over yet, and we must continue to support our DMCs, developing member countries, to deploy more vaccinations and other relevant public health interventions. I want to stress that I don't buy the argument that responding to the immediate needs of our DMCs, fight against a pandemic, and supporting their long-term goals are mutually exclusive. Nor do I accept the argument that the pandemic has altered our medium and long-term agenda, such as our Strategy 2030, which is, I think, still relevant. It is true that pandemic has significantly changed our economy, society, and culture in many ways. The new normal will not be exactly the same as what we had before, but I do not think that the pandemic has altered our long-term objective substantially to promote a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific. Rather, I am of a firm belief that COVID-19 and its impacts have sharpened the agenda laid out in the Strategy 2030 and the SDGs. Mm-hmm. So, now let me focus on 3 key areas of support going forward. First, our mission to eradicate poverty is more important than ever. COVID-19 has reversed much of the region's hard-earned progress in poverty reduction, regrettably. The steep decrease in economic activity in 2020 pushed an estimated approximately 75 to 80 million more people into extreme poverty. And so, we must redouble our efforts with investments in basic service to support health, education, and social protection to let them participate in the recovery process, in the growth process, and in the development process in a sustainable way. Second, we must step up the fight against climate change. Oh, this is a year of COP26. Everybody knows it. Mm-hmm. Global energy-related carbon emission fell last year by almost 60% due to the pandemic, stagnant behavior of our economic performance. With economies reopening now, energy-related CO2 emissions alone are expected to rise nearly 5% this year. It concerns me that more than 80% of the projected growth in coal demand, for example, will come from Asia. The pandemic has also highlighted the vulnerability of Asia and the Pacific. This region is very vulnerable to natural disaster, for example. So we must rebuild smartly from the pandemic to strengthen resilience to future shocks and to shift the global economy on a path toward net zero, all while creating jobs, increasing gender equality, tackling poverty, and improving people's quality of life. ADB stands ready, of course, to serve Asia and the Pacific as the region's climate bank. And thirdly, we must help to rebuild tax revenues. As public debt rises and the tax to GDP ratio of many countries in this region falls below the level necessary to support a sustainable recovery, they will need to restore fiscal balances by strengthening domestic resource mobilization, which means basically tax revenue, and take advantage of the international tax cooperation, which is now proceeding. To support our DMCs with this, we have established so-called Asia Pacific Tax Hub to promote policy discussion, to promote the knowledge sharing, and to enhance the cooperation with other international organizations. All these priorities are underpinned by knowledge support that will build on ADB's long-standing experience in Asia and Pacific, our large skill base, and our strong relationship with our DMCs. Okay, Suzanne, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Masa. I think you laid out the ambitious agenda that we have as ADB, and combining this ambitious agenda with our own transformation. So thank you very much. So considering that, I'd like to turn now to Mr. Ban. And listening, Mr. Ban, to the Honorable Fiame and our own president, I would like to ask you, what are your reflections? What do we need to do to sustain the momentum to still achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? What should be our role as development organizations, as ADB? And maybe some reflections from yourself. What would you do differently if you had to lead the design of the SDGs again?
I think we need to invest more of political will, more resources, and more collaboration among the organization and governments. Unfortunately, the progress made on the SDGs is fragile because of the COVID-19. Most of the resources available for any country have been put into fighting back this coronavirus. And of course, had we done more on climate and sustainable development goals, we would not have suffered from COVID-19. This is one hard lesson which we have learned. SDG did not consider sufficiently how institutions will be strengthened and capacity will be built to implement them. This is what I'm saying, that there was less political consideration, less emphasis by the political leaders. This is one thing. We are now in a very critical point in time. And the vulnerability of global collaboration has been surfaced, and trends towards more oppressive systems with less dialogue and debate has been seen. Development organizations and governments and multilateral development bank, MDBs like Asia Development Bank, often focus on quick wins and the tangible results rather than the long-term goals such as SDGs. This is what the President Masatsugu, I have been speaking with the President of African Development Bank about the importance of doing much more in African region. Now, there needs to be, we need to depoliticize the global crisis among nations through strengthening the role of multilateralism. In that regard, I'm quite concerned about this Sino-American relationship. I think they should more focus on collaboration rather than conflict. And they should do much more on fair competition rather than conflict. This is not time to focus on this, conflict issues. Of course, every country has some different systems, definitely China and the United States, they have both quite different systems, but we have to focus on climate action and also focus on COVID-19 and try to push it back as quickly as possible, eradicate. Then I think we can have some time to deal with this conflict matters. That's my very regrettable things. In that regard, the role of multilateral development banks should help strengthen countries' capacity and their own ability to prioritize development project plans and investment considering the common goods and the benefits and risks for future generations. We also keep in mind that developing knowledge economies and strengthening government agencies which use knowledge and evidence to inform policies. It may take time, but I think that depends upon the leadership, how we focus more on leadership. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ban. I think you really spoke from your heart, and you called upon us to enhance collaboration, put politics aside, and have a global mission, and that is to save the planet and the communities. So thank you. So let's hear now from Dr. Soumya. You were really at the front of at the WHO to bring, the quickly changing evidence into policy, to help craft responses, and at the same time manage, the expectations from global leaders and from the world to always come, with the best possible answer and have the solutions at hand. So maybe if you can share with us, Dr. Soumya, what challenges do you see currently, and what you saw in the crisis that challenged traditional evidence and knowledge to policy actions? What's standing in the way right now?
Thank you, Suzanne. And it's indeed a great pleasure to be with my other co-panelists in this very important discussion. As you know, the pandemic was something that came out of the blue. It was a new pathogen, a new virus that we had no experience with. And so at the beginning of 2020, I remember when we would all sit together with our emergency colleagues, Dr. Tedros and others, on a day-to-day or literally an hour-to-hour basis, updating what we knew about the information that was coming out of China initially, and at the same time having to make recommendations and guidance to give to the rest of the world. Because, as you know, WHO is the normative and standard-setting organization for health, and many, many countries around the world depend on WHO's guidance and advice. Our own normative work is based very heavily and strongly on an evidence and data-driven approach. And traditionally, the way that WHO guidelines are done is to synthesize the available evidence, to then have a guideline development group that would evaluate that evidence. And in addition to the quantitative data, they also look at things like ethics and equity and cost effectiveness and what benefits there are to especially the vulnerable sections of society. All of this takes time. And on average, it takes anything from 12 to 24 months to produce a guideline on a particular health topic. Now, clearly, we didn't have that kind of time. We do not have that time when it's an emergency. And so we had to be one step ahead of the evidence, almost. And so at the beginning, it was, what do we know about other coronaviruses that have, that human beings have been infected with in the past, the SARS and MERS and some of the other coronaviruses? What do we know about other respiratory viruses? And what can we infer? So policymakers are often in the same situation. When they have to make decisions, they don't have enough quantitative data in front of them. And even if they do, that data alone is insufficient for a policymaker or a head of state to make decisions which impact, millions of people. Let me tell you some of the innovations that we did and how we modified some of our own organizational procedures and approaches so that we could provide real-time responses. We put an emphasis on living guidelines. As I said, in the past, this is a process that would take months, sometimes years. We said every time there is a new clinical trial showing that there's evidence for a drug to be effective or not effective, that information needs to be disseminated to people, because clearly saving lives through the best possible use of treatments was important. And I must say that the researchers and academics around the world, scientists, really rallied. I think even people working in other disciplines sort of dropped what they were doing and focused on COVID. And this is why we have this huge explosion of scientific knowledge in this field. So on the other hand, when you have a huge explosion of knowledge, not everything is of high quality. And what was happening also is that you were getting confused because of the volume of knowledge. Everything was out in preprint, so it was not peer reviewed. And the media often highlighted the most dramatic of those studies, even though they may not be the best. So we put in place what we call the Evidence Collaborative for COVID-19. This is a network of 100 institutions where we coordinated the rapid reviews of synthesis. And I think these are some of the things that we should learn looking into the future. So they looked at so there was a reduction of research waste, there was a timely update of evidence, and this then fed into our guidelines. We also launched a COVID-19 database that initially was a few papers a day, and then it became hundreds of papers a day. We did this in multiple languages and provided access to this database, and we have over 100,000 active users really of this database, looking at it on a day-to-day basis, and you can search by various topics. So that was a service we provided. We also, of course, have the evidence-informed policy network that's been WHO has had for many years now, supporting member states to foster and promote the institutionalization of country capacity for an evidence-informed decision-making. So this is where I think is the crux. You can have global guidelines and recommendations, but then leaders in countries need to adapt, contextualize, and take those recommendations that make sense for their own communities. And also, they need a system where they're able to balance not just the quantitative or the scientific data that's coming in, but also apply it from the lens of economics and jurisprudence and ethics. And there are some examples of countries that set up these kind of multidisciplinary committees. Usually it's the ministries of health that make decisions, and all of the knowledge management and policy making is done by the ministries of health. But in a pandemic or in some of the other existential crises that Mr. Ban Ki-moon was talking about, and President Massa, climate change, for example, or air pollution, where there is a need to balance or to take the science, but then adapt and contextualize it. So this is where institutional capacity is extremely important, and a multidisciplinary expertise. You mentioned behavioral insights. We have set up a behavioral insights team in WHO because no public health programs can be successful without understanding and responding to people's behavior. And particularly when we've asked, billions of people to wear masks, to completely change their behavior, to maintain physical distancing. These are not things that come naturally to us. So how do we get people to listen to us when we say this is what you need to do, and continue over months and years? So I see that President Massa really talking about ADB becoming a knowledge bank in addition to a regular bank. And so I could envision closer collaboration between organizations like the ADB and the WHO, where we really promote the generation and use of knowledge. And as we invest in building back resilient health systems, I feel it's critically important to invest in institutional capacity, because it's not that we have to wait for the next pandemic. We have many, many threats around us that we need this type of networking and a decision-making process which is transparent, which is inclusive, and which is also willing to and needs to change to the changing evidence. I just want to quote, if I may, just before a A quote from Rudolf Virchow, who was a very famous physician in the 19th century. He investigated a scrub typhus outbreak in what is now Poland. And when he was asked, how do you prevent outbreaks? He said, it's quite simple. Education, together with its daughters, freedom and welfare.
Yeah.
We know that, diseases exploit weaknesses in society, and the inequities that already exist in society actually enable diseases to take a far bigger toll than they need to. So I think it's really important. He said in 1849 that it was education that was most important.
Thank you, Dr. Soumya. I think you touched on really the key points, right? It's about making sure policymakers can use the evidence that is being provided, and that requires capacity, that we invest in the basics, and that is education and welfare. And that comes back again to the SDGs and the importance to ensure we continue our commitment as organizations. And maybe let's hear now from Honorable Fiamé about, you've listened now to the former Secretary General, you've listened to President Massa, and to the Chief Scientist from WHO. What do you expect from your development partners when you work with them to help you make good policy decisions and consider potential trade-offs?
Thank you. Well, I think that our body of knowledge about this crisis needs to be continually updated, corrected, and refined, and that facts, information, and evidence need to be seen in the context. There's always insistence on contextualization so that any strategies developed is fit for purpose and the situation. I think it's important that there's mutual agreement, which be reached, and prioritized policies and investment decisions, and that also of respective roles of all that are involved have to be very clear. I think we must ensure meaningful and inclusive engagement with all stakeholders. Our government has established a weekly dialogue with the UN system, and there are 13 agencies in country for sharing of information, combining, facilitating, and connecting expertise to solve problems, and using a process that is constantly evolving and improving. I think in our particular context, there needs to be an understanding that there is a combination of culture, systems, and processes. That change is needed for knowledge management to help address the pandemic, and the same need is needed to solve the complex development challenges over the long term. And I take the point of Mr. President that the crisis, should not lead us to let go of those goals that we have determined are important for our respective societies to move forward. It's a different environment, but the issues remain the same, and I do take that point. I think when we are developing effective knowledge management strategies with partners, we should keep in mind that how that will contribute to the overall national goals, that there be balance between people, processes, and the technologies that we adopt, that we build timely organizational capabilities, and that is always shifting. And that we use common processes and technology to encourage the collaboration. The transformational element, I think, which is important with this discussion that we're having about knowledge management, the perception needs to carry with it that, whatever we are doing will have impactful results. So I think there is still a need to have a stronger sales pitch for the whole concept of knowledge management. We've done, of course, data collections about, different issues and so forth. But when we're building on this concept, and I note the comment about the bank not only being a bank for financial resources, but also a bank for information, and that that information source is very critical about how we allocate our respective resources.
Thank you, Honorable Femi. I think you said something very important, and that is you need this collaboration among development partners to create a joint and common knowledge plan to advise how to prioritize, how to make decisions, and how to balance and obviously address the needs of the communities. So maybe you don't need someone who advises you on the right solution, but to provide a menu of options and solutions that then need to be considered and weighed upon depending on your culture and values and the needs of your communities. So I think that's a very important take-home message for us as organizations. Thank you, Honorable Femi. Maybe now back to Dr. Soumya. You spoke a lot about the evidence-informed policy making and the networks that you have. Obviously, the natural partner of WHO is always the Ministry of Health. Can you maybe share a bit about, and there was also a question here from the audience, on how can WHO expand this? Because in a way, right, health is everything. If we are not healthy as people, then we can't really enjoy any of the other developments we have. How is WHO approaching that? And could there be some kind of joint capacity development effort across different agencies?
Yes, thank you, Suzanne. I think it's a very important question, and it would be, we're already working, of course, with a number of different agencies, including our partner UN agencies, but also well beyond that. We traditionally work also with the network of academic centers, what we call our WHO collaborating centers, and we want to establish stronger links now with academia, with universities, and also with youth. So we have a very big program to engage youth, because I think eventually to have successful knowledge management strategies and to have evidence to policy pathways, we need to engage both knowledge producers and knowledge users in a timely manner. Because ultimately, if you're not listening to the views of people who are ultimately the implementers or the knowledge users, then we may be faced with a situation where we're not as effective. So it's clear that young people today are, their voice is very loud and is being heard in the area of climate change, for example. We need a movement like that for health. And as you rightly said, health is beyond ministries of health. In fact, the determinants of health lie in all other sectors, whether it's road traffic injuries that we lose people to, whether it's air pollution, which is one of the biggest risk factors for health today, whether it's our processed foods that we're eating too much salt and sugar in. We have to engage sectors, including the private sector, if we have to make meaningful reductions in some of the risks. So I think traditionally we focus too much on the healthcare aspect, setting up hospitals and clinics and doctors and nurses, and not so much on the upstream determinants. We need to, and I think there were some wonderful comments also talking about One Health. We know that many of our problems arise because of our relationship with environment and with the animal world, and not just pandemics, but many other issues. So antimicrobial resistance is a good example also of where we need this kind of a coordinated approach. I think it's critical that we start encouraging what we call learning systems and organizations. And we've just produced a report on learning health systems and why it's important for ministries of health, but other ministries as well, to be effectively monitoring data and which informs their own policies and constantly being able to review what they're doing. There was, as I mentioned, a good example where in Germany, the National Academy of Sciences convened an expert group, which included historians of science, philosophers, theologians, and jurists, to provide advice to the government on how to ethically emerge from the initial shutdowns and lockdowns. And as we know, these lockdowns had devastating impacts on people, particularly in low-income countries. So a health person alone taking those decisions, it's very difficult really to look holistically. And so these type of institutional capacities or being able to pull together within the country experts you have in other disciplines. But I think very importantly, I'd also like to emphasize what the other speakers have said, the importance of regional and global collaboration, particularly when we have these kind of global challenges. A country by country approach is not going to bring us the solution. We have to learn from each other. We have to have mechanisms for sharing best practices. This is again where I see the ADB playing, a very critical role along with the other MDBs in becoming a knowledge partner. I think you already are, but this becomes, I think, much more important now to really be focusing on that aspect. And promoting collaboration and network is going to be very important.
Thank you, Dr. Soumya. Maybe before I can see we are approaching the end of this hour. Maybe I have one more question for the Honorable Fiammi, and that is really, do you think this whatever it takes approach to COVID, right, where we closed borders, we did everything possible to save lives, can you as a leader in the Pacific take this now and say, let's do the same for the climate crisis? If we can do it for COVID, we can do it for climate.
Okay. It's the perception of what is an urgent issue, and I think relating to your question on climate change, perhaps people have not necessarily seen that as they do with the COVID situation, because people are ill, they die. They do so in numbers. But I think what really needs for us to do using the pandemic response is to find what are those triggers and what has caused people to take action.
Excellent point. I think this is where, again, behavioral science comes in, right? And to some extent politics, and maybe also the need to influence those who make decisions more. So I'd like to turn now to President Massa and you listening to global leaders from public health, of course, a state leader, and then Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and you being a leader now of the ADB. What was your biggest reflection, your lesson learned as a leader during these last 18 months, leading this organization through the difficult time, but also the transformation?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. Before answering your question, let me briefly respond to a couple of points raised by our panelists. First of all, Mr. Ban Ki-moon rightly pointed out that ADB and other development organizations have a tendency often focus on just quick wins and tangible results and forget about the long-term to medium-term to long-term development challenges. Yes, that's true. And I cannot really disagree with that we sometimes, just become myopic and just focus on the issues we are facing at that time. So we always bear in mind that, ultimate goal is, various development challenges, for example, laid out by Strategy 2030 and also SDGs. Just two things. Last year in 2020, ADB's total amount of operation committed was $31.6 billion, which was record high, almost 33% jump from 2019. But the fact is, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the half of this 31.6 billion was COVID related. And another half of 31.6 was non-COVID related. So I think I can say that ADB did not forget the medium to long-term development challenges like climate change, gender, high-quality infrastructure, and poverty reduction. And also, as I mentioned in my first remarks, I think those two challenges, short-term measures to cope with pandemic, long-term, medium to long-term development challenges are not mutually exclusive. They are related to each other. They complement each other. So we should do both. One response to Dr. Somiya. Thank you very much for offering further collaboration between WHO and ADB, which is crucial from now on. For example, when we introduced the APVAX, vaccine financing facility, in December last year, we did it with the amount of $9 billion to help other people in this region. But frankly speaking, we are not a pandemic expert. We are not vaccine expert. So for example, how to set the eligibility criteria, vaccine eligibility criteria, which should be financed by APVAX. We have no idea, right? So we relied a lot on expertise from WHO and so on. And also from now on, I think triggered by this pandemic, I think our operation in health sector need to be increased more and more. It's a very important investment in human capital. So our collaboration with WHO, please, help us. And I very much would like to, collaborate more closely with you. Okay. Finally, responding to Suzanne's point, yes, I had to make decisions during a period of uncertainty that was truly unprecedented for our organizations. As president of ADB, my most important challenge was, and continue to be, of course, to protect the safety and health of our staff while continuing to support our clients who are in dire need of assistance. We shut down ADB headquarters on March 12 last year, 3 days before all of the Metro Manila went into lockdown. Even after more than 1.5 years of this pandemic, you see only small numbers of staff working in HQ, almost nobody here, and field offices for safety reasons. And about 40% of our international staff are currently working from home, outside of their duty station, outside of Manila. So despite these unprecedented circumstances, our operations were not disrupted last year. In fact, our performance was outstanding in terms of our lending volume and our borrowing program, as I mentioned briefly. Both reached record highs last year. We responded effectively to the requests from our DMCs to cope with the pandemic and to deliver on our regular development projects. The work from home arrangements have worked well, and I am so thankful for the technologies that made them possible, along with our dedicated staff who worked 24 hours, 7 days a week. To better serve our clients, we will become more resilient and flexible by continuing to invest in the technology and improving the way we work. We also need to deepen the impact of our collective knowledge and related activities. We will make a bigger difference when ADB acts as a knowledge provider together with providing support through financing. So let me conclude with a reflection that I think we can all grasp on the personal level. Most people agree that the COVID-19 crisis is the biggest crisis of the century to date. And now we are starting to talk about a new normal. But in the life of the girl in a poor, remote part of her country, very little may have changed during the last decade or the last 18 months, especially if her opportunity have not increased. So when we speak about the new normal, let's make sure that we work to change the normal of those who have so often been left behind. The most important lesson for us as leaders is to keep our organizations focused on the long-term prospects for the people we serve, even when facing times of crisis. I stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Masa. I think you brought the human face to what we all do here in our ADB, but also as global development community. And as Honorable Fiame said, it's about the communities at the end. And I think the appeal from Mr. Ban to all of us also made it very clear that's our responsibility. We need to make sure that those people who were left behind and don't have and didn't have opportunities, that they get them through our combined knowledge and our actions. And with that, I'd really like to thank you all, Mr. Ban, Honorable Fiame, President Massa, and Dr. Somya for making time for this hour today. I think you provided very provocative and interesting messages. You show as leaders that it is about not having knowledge only, but to apply it well and to be very aware of for whom we apply it. And with that, I would like to thank you all and wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.